Welcome back to Movies Outpost. Today we'll be recapping the Venom franchise. This will include Venom as well as Venom Let There Be Carnage. This duology is about to become a trilogy, and as usual, sit back, relax and enjoy the recap. Another night in space, we see an aircraft coming in hot catching on fire, colliding with major impact. In East Malaysia, the emergency services appear to inspect the crash, retrieving a package with something in it. Meanwhile, at a lab, we see Carlton Drake investigating the situation, whilst his crews show him the footage explaining the situation. The response crew find a surviving astronaut named Jameson, and attempting to help save his life, they rush him to a nearby hospital. Waking up, Jameson attacks the help with some sort of superpower, causing the ambulance to flip. Shockingly enough, the lady he attacked breaks through the vehicle unaffected and unfazed continues walking through the streets. Back in California, Eddie is woken up by Anne, who brings him a coffee. Eddie Brock is seen riding his bike to work, showing us he is a reporter seen talking about the protests taking place in America. He arrives at work acknowledging the lobby guard, only to have a meeting with his boss warning him to pick up his act. Later that night, he is seen having a date with Anne at a restaurant and afterwards goes on a ride, sharing a nice moment. In the middle of the night, Eddie wakes up to rehydrate and notices a laptop filled with pictures of himself and Anne. An idea enters his head as he begins snooping around Anne's laptop, coming across a confidential file which he reads. The next day, Carlton is seen giving a group of kids an inspiring speech to change the world. His doctor then interrupts him, informing him of his interview, which is shockingly enough with Eddie. Eddie kicks off the interview and begins hammering him with allegations. The interview is then cut short, prompting Eddie to be escorted out. Back at work, Eddie's boss questions him as to who's his source, but denies having one, which leads him to get fired. Knowing the man she trusted snooped through her work, Anne is frustrated with Eddie, as she was also fired, leading her to break up with him for good. On a rainy night elsewhere, many vehicles are seen driving to a secure spot, showcasing a kind of weird unearth-like thing that was seen at the crash site. Carlton is astonished by the thing and smiles at the possibilities. Elsewhere, the same lady who left the crash scene is seen walking amongst the public when she begins to eat raw fish, causing hostility from a shop owner, killing him with what she has been infected by. This outrage causes gang members to try and fight her, but she kills them with ease. Approaching an elderly lady, she passes on the venom to her. 6 months later, we see the same gooey substance being used on a rabbit as an experiment, while Dr. Skirth and Carlton overwatch this. He informs her to start this experiment using humans as test dummies, which makes her hesitant. Downtown, we see Eddie at the bar depressed, and upon seeing Carlton on the TV, he leaves. On his way home, though, he bumps into a lady who sells him a newspaper, and continuing on his walk makes his way into a store. He is greeted by Mrs. Chen, who informs him he looks horrible. A man then walks in and demands money from Mrs. Chen, whilst Eddie hides and waits for the situation to de-escalate before buying his items and leaving. Walking to his apartment, he enters his place all alone, looking after his plant, but sees all the overdue bills. He makes calls and asks for gigs so that he can get back on his feet, but is rejected, leading him to lay on the floor peacefully. In doing so, he hears rock music being played, which infuriates him, causing him to put a pillow over his ears to block out the sound. Back on the island, Carlton is seen with his crew bringing in their first human dummy to take part in the experiment to see how this venom works on human figures. Carlton reassures him everything is going to be okay, telling him they must change the world together. They release the gooey substance, attaching itself to the man as they monitor his body, but to everyone's shock, he starts reacting in an odd manner. He collapses, causing the gooey substance to leave his body as it latches itself onto the glass, whilst the professors watch in confusion. Meanwhile, Eddie continues his lonely walks, picking up a newspaper, making his way into a store. He seems to be talking to himself, but it turns out he is calling out Dr. Skirth's horrible job at following him. She introduces herself, chasing after him, explaining that the article he published was spot on, and informs him on how Carlton uses humans as lab rats. She pleads with him for help, but Eddie, fed up, just walks away. He soon arrives at a house only for Anne to turn up with her new partner Dan. The old couple talk, and Eddie explains he misses the old days, but Anne walks away, still disappointed. Saddened by this, he stands on the edge of a highway and contemplates his next move, and is distracted by a passing helicopter. Eddie instantly calls the doctor, and linking up with her, they make their way to Carlton's lab. Entering the underground entrance, she explains all the things she has witnessed and even mentions aliens, to which Eddie laughs at her. They then hear a guard coming, which leads Eddie to enter the lab while the doctor distracts him. Eddie investigates the lab and takes pictures, but is met with a shock as Maria, the lady who had handed him the newspaper earlier, is also being used as a lab rat. He tries to help her, but is instead attacked, releasing venom onto him. The alarms are then activated, causing him to run and sidestep some guards in his way. Breaking down a door in his way, he also breaks through a high fence and runs through the forest, only to be chased by a dune buggy and many other guards. They don't find him though, as we see Eddie is hiding high up in the trees, hanging on for dear life like he is Tarzan. Quickly arriving at home, Eddie calls the doctor, but has an unusual reaction, eating anything in his path as his eyes change. He rushes to the toilet, spewing everywhere. Confused, he knocks himself out in the bathtub. Staring at a lifeless body, Carlton is informed that his product was taken, approaching another subject, while Skirth wonders what happened to Eddie. Waking up, Eddie notices the mess made in his apartment but pays no mind, continuing to examine the pictures he took whilst at the lab. The infected lady in the meantime is at the airport and is up to something sinister. Eddie, still making calls, hears a voice in his head when he receives a text from Skirth telling him to be careful. Entering a restaurant, he bumps into Anne and Dan and tries to explain himself, but funnily enough, eats a massive chunk of meat. He starts going wild, grabbing food from other people's tables only for Anne to slap him. He still continues his wild behavior though, and Eddie starts to overheat and makes his way into a fish tank as Dan tries to stop a woman from calling 911. The old couple then get into a heated argument, only for Eddie to shockingly grab a lobster and start eating it. After the chaos, Eddie is seen doing scans being looked after by Dan. They discuss what happened, but when the scans start, Eddie has a reaction, almost transforming into something. Panicking, Dan rushes in to attempt to help him, trying to calm him down. He sits up right as the doctor monitors his body levels. They walk through the hospital, bumping into a nice lady with her puppy, leaving Eddie confused when the dog starts barking at him. Dan tells Eddie to rest as he leaves. In the meantime, Dr. Skirth enters her office only to be confronted by the guard sitting on her seat, striking fear into her. Still underground, experiments are being undertaken whilst Carlton discusses with his doctors why the subjects keep dying and failing. Trying another test, a painful reaction takes place on the subject, turning it back down as Carlton observes the subject through the glass, monitoring his behavior. The guards approach, holding Dr. Skirth as Carlton is in disbelief. The next day, Eddie is seen on the tram sweating profusely, but is surprised when the symbiote forces him up out of his seat, causing confusion. He holds onto the door, finally making it back to his unit. He gets a call from Anne, who checks up on his well-being, informing him the scans indicate he has parasites. Eddie scratches his head, explaining he is hearing a voice, but stops when Dan interrupts him. Eating with Anne, he starts explaining how he climbed like Tarzan whilst Dan starts explaining the parasite. Meanwhile, Eddie has a reaction, making him go crazy. Eddie, hearing music blaring next door, smashes on his neighbor's door as he answers rudely. This releases Venom, scaring the crap out of him, agreeing to turn it down whilst closing his door. Back at the lab, Dr. Skirth and Carlton talk about the other night when she is given a chance to make it right by giving up who was with her. He then starts telling her that the symbiote is dangerous and needs her friend to step forward, but she is very hesitant to give up Eddie. Eventually, his words affect her, causing the doctor to give Eddie's name up, and as he walks away angrily, the symbiote is released, leaving Skirth to face the consequences of her mistake. Still eating like crazy, Venom tells Eddie to leave the door locked, but upon opening it is attacked by multiple men who aim their weapons at him. Venom then controls Eddie's actions, not allowing him to surrender, leading to him being tasered. Disapproving of the men's attack, Venom fights back with rage as the men are no challenge for the mighty Venom. Confused with this situation, while seeing the gooey substance coming out from his hands, Venom once again attacks another man as more enter. He throws them around like feathers, finally crippling the men and allowing Eddie the chance to make a run for it while the neighbor witnesses his escape. While being shot at, Eddie jumps out of a window and attaches himself to a bar to swing like Spider-Man and crash into a stranger's apartment. Continuing to be shot at, Venom saves Eddie again while Carlton's men enter their vehicles and send him the live feed of Venom. The whole staff watches in surprise as Eddie is still alive, causing excitement for Carlton, telling his men to bring him in. In the meantime, still running, Eddie notices Venom's reflection in the car window, who starts talking again. Insulting Venom, he sticks Eddie on a wall, giving the men a chance to track him down via a drone. Managing to dodge the explosion of the drone, he instantly jumps on the bike, riding off like a madman as Carlton makes it clear not to allow him to get away. The men release drones to track down their symbiote while Eddie continues weaving through traffic, only for a drone to explode behind him. Fed up, Venom takes over and causes one drone to crash into a civilian's car, causing it to explode. While Carlton watches this happen, Venom rides the bike and evades the drones by managing to block the explosion as they wreak havoc amongst the public. A drone then manages to catch up and explode, but Eddie miraculously rides straight through it without a scratch. Carlton informs his men to catch him, but Venom uses his power to maneuver himself out of the way, leaving the men in absolute shock. They stay on his tail though, and Venom rides uphill, then launches the bike mid-air while latching himself back to it. The men then manage to corner the duo, and thinking quickly, Venom swings over the dead end as the cars chase, causing Eddie to be crushed between two SUVs, but Venom manages to shove their cars away. Continuing to ride off, Eddie is hit by a car, which makes him tumble off the bike. The thug there stands over Eddie, who lays there in excruciating pain, making Venom appear once more to manhandle the thug by throwing him and biting another before taking off like Forrest Gump and damaging all vehicles he encounters to safely get to the other side of the water. Eddie returns to his human form, confused as to how his body has healed, but Venom comes out face to face with Eddie to explain everything. This freaks him out, but is reassured if he cooperates with Venom, he will survive what is to come. Back at the airport, a little girl walks around with a symbiote inside her. Anne then receives a call from Dan explaining Eddie doesn't have parasites but something else. Unfortunately for Dr. Skirth though, the symbiote seems to have killed her, leading Carlton to tell off his staff and the man who lost Eddie. Arriving at the police scene, Anne is confused, asking an officer what took place here, as it is outside Eddie's apartment. Meanwhile, Eddie is headed to his former boss only to pick up his phone and talk with Anne when he is cut off. Stopped by his friend, he is told he cannot go up, and Venom almost kills him until Eddie stops him and walks out. Looking up to the top of the tower, Venom begins climbing the building and does it in perfect style. Sitting at the top overlooking the whole city, a passing aeroplane instigates a reaction, bringing Eddie back to his human form and falling off the skyscraper. Venom saves his ass though and quickly jumps into his old boss's office. Eddie then writes a note for him and leaves the evidence of Carlton and his company. However, on his way back down, he is met by a force of soldiers with heavy artillery. They put their red lasers at the ready, but Venom appears, showing his strength, and even catches a tear canister. Emptying their mags, Venom is unfazed and disappears from their sights, only to ambush them, taking them out one by one, showing us his rage. Trying to find Venom in their scope, they are attacked as Venom takes out more of the soldiers. One soldier throws something, engaging Venom and causing him to leap upwards to handle business. Desperate, the soldiers open fire, allowing the monster to meet them head-on with his brute strength while roaring like the beast he is with his weird-ass tongue. Anne then arrives, and whilst a soldier shoots at Venom and is almost eaten, Anne stops him. Returning to normal, Eddie follows Anne, who is horrified, while he explains what's happening. A car door is then opened for Eddie, and proceeding to go on a drive with his old partner, they talk with each other. Suddenly though, a drone appears behind them and in the lab. Meanwhile, Carlton walks around and is met by the young girl from earlier. To his surprise, she chokes him and begins releasing the symbiote on him. Meanwhile, downtown, Dan informs Eddie of his heart rate, who asks if there's a solution. But Venom keeps playing with his head. Anne then pleads with Venom, only angering him, grabbing the throat of Dan, which makes her react. He starts having an abnormal reaction and unleashes all his anger, which shockingly enough releases Venom from his body. Latching onto the glass, Eddie confronts him, scolding him for everything he has put him through. Eddie then exits the room and leaves Dan and Anne with Venom, who sneaks his way out through the vent. They argue over what just took place, but Anne notices Venom is no longer there. Elsewhere in the hospital, the same puppy barks at the vent, who sees Venom. In a hurry, Eddie rushes to exit the building, but unfortunately is met by the same men, shooting him down. The puppy then makes its way through the hospital corridors, coming into contact with Anne, showing its demonic eyes. Back at a different location, Eddie is tied up, being antagonized by Carlton's man, who is head-butted. Carlton arrives finally face to face with Eddie and asks about his symbiote, while also lecturing him to try and make him feel bad. Fed up, Carlton asks one last time before transforming himself into another version of Venom, horrifying Eddie. Returning back to himself, Carlton comes up with a plan to find the others. In a dark forest later, Eddie is chucked onto the ground by Carlton's men, who are ready to kill him. Astonishingly enough, Venom arrives, saving Eddie, who then proceeds to pick him up. He is astonished when he learns that Anne is his savior, and Venom reunites with his original host. Carlton meanwhile discusses a rocket being launched into space with his staff, as a doctor behind them is in shock. Continuing his journey through the forest, Venom and Eddie keep talking with each other and finally stumble across Carlton's spacecraft. Carlton meanwhile initiates the launch of his spacecraft, planning to bring more symbiotes to Earth. When someone attempts to abort the mission though, Carlton reveals his true self and destroys the entire room. After taking off running, Venom spots his adversary. Anne in the meantime runs towards the lab, whilst Venom chases Carlton and Riot and finally comes face to face with him. Riot tells Venom to get on the craft, and Venom tells him he no longer wants to destroy the world. This ultimately leads to both of them throwing blows at each other. With a couple minutes till launch, Riot tells Venom he is not strong enough and does a very dangerous move. Coming into contact with each other though, Venom is absolutely overpowered. Being thrown around like a doll, Riot rips Venom away from its host and goes to eat him just as Eddie reconnects with him. The two humans and symbiotes then have an outstanding fight with one another when Riot sucks them all up and transforms into an enormous beast, and then blasts a loud vibrating sound, irritating both the hosts, causing them both to fall and release their symbiotes. The two continue fighting in their human form, brawling as Eddie Superman punches Carlton, who tries reaching for his symbiote but is kicked off the edge by Eddie. He then runs away, only to be stabbed from behind by Riot and Carlton. Eddie lays there lifeless, whilst Carlton continues his path by entering the spaceship. Venom soon arrives though and attaches himself to Eddie's lifeless body, bringing him back to life. Rising as he roars and removing the blade, Venom launches himself at the spacecraft, coming face to face with Carlton and taunting him and jumping off to use the blade to tear apart the ship. This causes a mass explosion, causing Carlton to perish, while Venom tells Eddie goodbye as they land in the water beneath them. Looking down and out, Eddie, still with all his might, resurfaces above the water, pushing himself to stay afloat, only to see all the chaos and fire surrounding him. In the meantime, after all this madness, Eddie and Anne are seen having a happy conversation, discussing all the events and past things that have happened. He then excuses himself as Stan Lee gives him advice, whilst Eddie pets his dog. Continuing his walk downtown, he and Venom talk amongst each other, acting like a normal person in public. Eddie then enters Mrs. Chen's shop again, only to see the same bully aiming a gun at her. This time Eddie stands up for her, threatening the man to leave her alone but changes his mind by eating him, then leaving the shop as if nothing ever happened. In an end credit scene later at the San Quentin prison, Eddie, being the journalist he is, walks through the gates to meet one of the deadliest inmates in there. Coming into contact with Cletus, the man tells Eddie to come over. He tells him that when he breaks out there will be carnage. In a dark corner of California, several people are seated in a reform school. A girl is dragged out and put into a sheriff's van while a man screams and bangs from the window above. In the back of the van, she uses her powers to attack the men, which leads to her being shot and tumbling out of the vehicle. She wakes up with her eye bandaged and sees another woman in the room with her. Fast forward to the present day. A woman walks through a hallway and observes the same girl. This woman is Frances Barrison, who gets angry upon reading a newspaper article about Cletus, then rolls back to sleep. Meanwhile, Cletus is locked in a cell. Downtown, Eddie is at the police department discussing matters with an officer, almost leading to him being eaten by Venom. Eddie and Venom argue, almost getting caught by the officer eavesdropping. They continue to fight in the bathroom, scaring a woman in the next cubicle who looks underneath to see who Eddie is talking to. Eddie exits the bathroom and encounters the confused officer who questions him about what he just heard. At San Quentin, Cletus is being interviewed by Eddie about his case as a serial killer, and an article is published about him. On his way out, Eddie glances into a room, noticing symbols before exiting the prison. Eddie continues walking with Detective Mulligan, who lectures him as Eddie jumps on his bike and rides off, ignoring the detective's words. Back at his apartment, Eddie redraws the same symbols he saw during his interview with Cletus, but Venom interrupts, making him draw other things. Venom's hands emerge, researching information and placing one of the drawings on an image. At Rodeo Beach, California, a crime scene is active while Eddie talks to reporters, frustrating the detective who is angry Eddie beat him to the scene. The death penalty is reinstated specifically for Cletus, causing Francis to go mad upon learning a date has been set for his execution. Meanwhile, Eddie rides like a madman, clearly pleased with the unfolding events. During the night downtown, Venom sits on the couch and smashes his head through the roof, eager to fight some bad guys and getting angry at Eddie. He destroys the TV, flinging Eddie to the floor, who tells Venom he needs to control his hunger. Eddie goes through his notebook while researching on his laptop, arguing with Venom the entire time. Enraged, Venom forces Eddie to repeatedly tap his buttons until Eddie finally gives in and goes to get him food. On his way to the store, Eddie greets Mrs. Chen, who blackmails them, not realizing Venom is about to eat her, leaving her horrified. Venom then makes his way onto a rooftop, sitting by a rooster climbing across the building and running at full speed. To their surprise, they come across a crime in progress. Excited, Venom confronts the mugger, holding him up and wanting to eat him. Eddie disagrees and doesn't allow it, leading Venom to launch the man instead. Still hungry, Venom jumps from building to building, leaving Eddie dangling from the roof while answering Anne's call in the air. Anne asks about his well-being and health. They agree to meet as Anne wants to inform Eddie of something, and he agrees, still hanging on for dear life. The next day, Eddie arrives at the restaurant and greets Anne with a warm hug, making her chuckle, happy to see him. They start talking, but Anne reveals her engagement ring, leaving Venom and Eddie shocked. Eddie tries to play it off, pretending the news doesn't affect him. Anne asks about Venom, and Eddie lies, saying he is dead before telling her not to marry Dan. Anne asks Venom to look after Eddie, knowing he is still inside, before leaving sadly in the rain. Venom consoles Eddie and stops him from riding off madly. In the morning, Venom spoils Eddie, trying to cheer him up by cooking, but instead it irritates Eddie as he receives his mail. He reads a letter from Cletus, who invites him to watch his execution, blaming Eddie for his death and detailing some of his horrific crimes, including how Francis protected him from bullies. Eddie and Venom discuss attending the execution date while getting food, only to be squirted by sauce. Later, Eddie returns to the prison, seeing all the prisoners nearby while walking and talking with the officers. Cletus and Eddie have another meeting where Cletus laughs and tries to guilt-trip Eddie, making him feel responsible for sending Cletus to his death. Venom, getting angry, grabs Cletus and attacks him, allowing Cletus to bite Eddie's hand. Cletus, being cunning, reveals to Eddie that his blood isn't normal as Eddie exits the visitation area. Arriving back at his apartment, Eddie angrily confronts Venom, saying he shouldn't have touched Cletus. Venom, enraged, emerges to face Eddie, who tells Venom he doesn't want him anymore. Venom smacks Eddie, leading to a big fight that destroys the apartment. Eddie apologizes to his downstairs neighbor for the noise before returning to the battle, only to see Venom latch onto another man. Eddie looks outside to find his bike being torn apart as Venom leaves, flipping him off. Amidst the chaos, Cletus is seen strapped to a chair as toxins are released to execute him. Cletus begins to react, transforming into a monstrous form, causing the spectators to flee in terror. In his new form, Cletus rampages through the prison, killing anyone in his path and wreaking havoc on the guards. He forms a tornado, carrying and killing a man before breaking through the prison walls and escaping as a free man, eventually returning to his human form. Meanwhile, Eddie is seen fixing his apartment after Venom's mess, cleaning up and staring at the roosters before finding a place to leave them. Free of Venom, he watches TV and is shocked to learn of Cletus's release. There's a knock at the door, and he answers to find the detective. Inviting him in, they discuss Cletus's release, with the detective suspicious of Eddie, thinking he might have something to do with the escape. He advises Eddie to lay low before leaving. Eddie tries to figure out how Cletus managed to escape by analyzing the clues. Downtown, Venom is seen partying and being appreciated by people while Cletus continues his killing spree. Blending in with the public, Cletus comes across a car, jumps in and drives off, chased by a hopeless man. On a bridge, Cletus is seen driving, talking to his new monstrous form in the mirror, discussing how they're going to kill Venom and Eddie. Cletus insists they must save someone he values before putting their plan into motion. Meanwhile, Venom is partying, surrounded by humans, and makes his way to the stage as a girl sings. He takes the mic, making it awkward as the music cuts off, but a man compliments his suit and the crowd cheers for him. Venom starts ranting about Eddie, revealing how he kept him hidden, leaving the crowd stunned and the singer scared. He gives an amazing speech, receiving love from the crowd before dropping the mic and walking away, depressed, wishing Eddie was with him to see the love he received. Eddie investigates the place where Cletus and Francis were held and quickly calls Detective Mulligan. Revealing that Cletus and Francis are in love and likely headed there next, Mulligan interrupts, revealing he was the one who shot Francis, thinking she had died. He remembers the sound from the day he shot Francis, which irritates him, making him touch his ears. Continuing his journey, Cletus drives the stolen car, drifting into a petrol station. He exits, enters the store, and attacks a man for no reason, stomping on his head and killing him. He hacks into the man's laptop to track down Francis, finding her whereabouts. At the mental asylum, the old lady enters Francis' spot to inform her of Cletus's escape, causing her to jump up. The old lady antagonizes her, but Francis types "screw you," mocking her. Suddenly, Cletus appears, making Francis happy. He chokes and kills the old lady before greeting his beloved and introduces her to Carnage before freeing her for good. The guards and staff attempt to stop them but are no match for Carnage, who smashes a hole through the wall and escapes with Francis in her dream car. Evading the police in a high-speed chase, Carnage holds police vehicles up in the air, attacking and destroying them to ensure their freedom. Francis cheers in excitement, acknowledging her feelings for Cletus. As a helicopter opens fire, she uses her power, causing it to explode. Cletus informs her that sound isn't good for Carnage, and they clear their path by attacking another helicopter. Downtown, a man enters Mrs. Chen's store and vomits. She tries to order him out, but Venom talks to her and she comforts him. Detective Mulligan, still processing recent events, visits the undisclosed location and sees the chaos Carnage left while rescuing Francis. Eddie is in the interrogation room, being interviewed by the detective, who questions why Cletus only spoke with him and mentions all the bodies Venom took out. Mulligan mentions monsters, confusing Eddie, who then realizes how Cletus unleashed Carnage, recalling when he was bitten. Meanwhile, Anne and Dan drive to offer help to Eddie, arriving at the police station and demanding to see him. Anne manages to get into the room, confronting Eddie and asking him to give up information. Eddie disagrees, covering his mouth and whispering to her that Venom is no longer with him, while the detective lingers, trying to listen in. Anne and Dan then head to Mrs. Chen's shop, asking her about Venom. They notice a news feed reporting Cletus is armed and advising people to stay inside, which freaks Dan out. Mrs. Chen is hostile to the couple, but Anne, being clever, calls out Venom. Knowing he has taken over Mrs. Chen's body, Venom reveals himself by showing his eyes and refuses to help Eddie. Anne uses a seductive tone to compliment Venom and his abilities, which makes him cocky. He grows ahead and agrees to help, impressed by her flattery. Walking away from the chaos they've caused, Cletus and Francis bond happily over the violence. They talk with Carnage, planning to target Venom, Eddie Brock, and Detective Mulligan. Back at the police station, Anne enters smiling, revealing that Venom is back. She breaks them out, causing the detective to panic. The officers enter the room to find them all gone, angering Mulligan. Meeting up with Dan, Venom insists Eddie apologize to gain his help. Eddie admits he needs him and they finally reconcile. Anne hugs Eddie as Venom re-enters Eddie's body. Eddie then informs Dan of the plan before shaking his hand as they drive off. Detective Mulligan heads to Brock's apartment only to find Cletus waiting for him. Mulligan exits his car and aims his weapon, but Cletus calmly unleashes Carnage. Meanwhile, Francis enters Eddie's empty apartment searching for clues. She finds an engagement ring and puts it on, then notices a portrait of Anne, realizing who Eddie cares for. Dan quickly packs up and rushes to his car, but Francis attacks him from behind. Anne, also packing, meets Francis, who scares her by threatening to kill Dan unless Eddie is found. Francis gives Dan a letter to deliver to Eddie, to protect Anne. In the city, helicopters search for Cletus and Francis. Eddie sees this but is interrupted by a call from Dan, who informs him of the situation and asks him to save Anne. Eddie and Venom gear up. At a wedding venue, Francis walks down the aisle to marry Cletus. The detective and Anne are held hostage. Cletus unveils Francis and the priest begins the ceremony. They are interrupted by Venom, who appears to save Anne and end the violence. Carnage also appears, scaring Venom and leaving Eddie alone in his human form, confused. Venom congratulates the couple and tries to leave, but Cletus provokes him. Eddie laughs, trying to bring Venom back. Venom finally listens, transforming back into his strong self. As a fight kicks off, Francis uses her power and irritates the both of them and is shoved away. Venom and Carnage charge at each other, fighting blow for blow, smashing each other. Carnage launches Venom at the wall and stabs him with his blades. Francis confronts Mulligan, threatening him, but but Carnage grabs her, leading to an argument. The detective attempts to flee while Venom frees himself from the blades, but Carnage grabs him again, proving a point by killing the priest. Mulligan climbs to freedom but is ambushed by Francis, who knocks him down. Despite this, he continues to fight her as she tries to gouge his eye out. Bravely, Dan appears with fire, setting Carnage alight and causing Francis to rush to his side as he screams in agony. Dan runs, but Carnage catches up, ready to kill him, only to be interrupted by a bell, causing the symbiote's excruciating pain. Returning to their human forms, Cletus starts bashing Eddie before transforming back into Carnage and throwing Eddie through the air. They fight again, with Venom initially gaining the upper hand, but Carnage quickly overpowers him. Cletus, furious with Eddie for sending him to his death, hits him hard with a hammer. Meanwhile, Francis kills Detective Mulligan. Carnage grabs Anne, showing her to Eddie as Dan pleads with him to save her. Exhausted, Venom struggles to move. Francis confronts Cletus, saying things have gone too far, which offends Carnage, who kills her against Cletus's pleads. Venom then gets back up to finally end this. He climbs to the top of the building, with Carnage right behind, about to eat Anne. Venom leaps off the building, stabbing Carnage and rescuing Anne, but it's not enough to defeat Carnage. Venom holds onto Anne, nearly falling to her death. Venom is stabbed again, but manages to release Anne into Dan's arms. Severely wounded, Venom is stabbed once more by Carnage. Surprisingly, Francis stands and confronts Venom, who knocks her into the bell. As she falls, she unleashes a final scream, shattering the building. Eddie in his human form falls, but is saved by Anne and Dan. Cletus also falls, trying to reunite with Carnage. Venom, hungry, starts eating Carnage, leaving Cletus defeated. Venom picks up Cletus, and Eddie reveals half his face to listen to Cletus's final words before Venom succumbs to his hunger and eats him. Fleeing the scene, the trio tries to escape. Eddie stops, letting Anne and Dan leave as the police arrive looking for Venom. Weirdly enough though, the detective awakens with a light in his eyes saying the word monsters. Back at the location where the roosters were dropped off, Venom and Eddie discuss their differences and acknowledge they are now fugitives. On an island, they sit peacefully, bonding in front of a beach and an amazing view as their journey comes to an end. Later in an end credit scene, Eddie watches some TV when his shack shakes and transforms into something else. Confused, he stares at the TV when Spider-Man gets on the screen and makes Venom quite horny. If you've reached up to this point, it means you like my videos and I'd be happy to share some more with you.